I'm very happy to be here. I probably could have got myself arrested. They were working on the tracks, and the train stopped for a bit, and I looked out the window, and there was a sign, and I just wanted to steal it. A big sign, sort of a triangle, and it said, "Men working online." With that much separation between on and line, and I nearly dashed out of the train. I'm sure I would have been arrested for that. And it's nothing to do with either the Institute or with Google or any such. I stopped and asked for directions. Yeah, and I was told, St. Giles, go that way. So, I saw some nice pubs and what have you, but it was definitely not the right direction. In any event, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for attending today. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of an idea of my background, of which Bill's already said a number of things, as a way to provide some context for what I'd like to say about where I think Internet studies may be heading, or in my case, where I would like to see it head. That was the first computer that I used. It was a digital PDP-8E. It was about the size of a refrigerator. And I almost always ask this question, because I think the answer to this provides a pretty good context. It had 64K of RAM. Any guesses about how much another 64K would have cost us to add to it? Pounds or dollars, or what? Pick your currency. Any guesses? $100,000. You can't do anything with 64K today, right? I mean, even a bloated Word document is going to be more than 64, or actually an unbloated one is going to be over 64K. We were using paper tape and punch cards to store things. I don't know if any of you had experience with paper tape, but it was a wonderful medium in which to learn editing, right? That served me well later when I was working in recording studios. That would be an entirely separate digression here that I don't want to get into. I was very fortunate to be at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the 1970s. As fortunate as I was to have gone to a high school outside of Chicago that had access to that PDP-8E, we had something called Plato, which stands for, just for clarity, Programmed Logic for Automatic, I thought it was automated, I may have made a mistake there, teaching operations. Its 50th anniversary is coming up next month at the Computer History Museum in San Jose, or near San Jose. There's a sort of a celebration going on, which should be quite interesting. I've not been in touch with Plato users for I don't know how long, but in many ways, the reason really that I want to bring it up is it formed a foundation for me, at least, and I think for a lot of other people too, about the kinds of things that people do with computers that are networked together. David Woolley and Ray Ozzie were probably the sort of legendary figures by the time that I got there in the late 70s already, because they developed some of the software that was underlying the system as we used it every day. So particularly Talk, which was a kind of instant messaging or chat type of system, and then Notes. Now, it's sort of useful to remember why they wrote these programs. The Plato lab at the digital computing labs at the university was in a basement room roughly 2 to 3 times this size. And the terminals, right, this was a mainframe basis, and the terminals sort of ringed around, the outside, the periphery of the room. And if you're at one end doing one thing and somebody that you wanted to talk to is at the other end, you'd have to get up and walk over and talk to them. Well, we were geeks, we were lazy, right? We were not, athletically minded, to the degree that we found it just sort of a drag to have to get up and, walk across. So David wrote up Talk so that we could message one another. What he and Ray discovered later was that, and not much later, was that it was very useful to be able to refer back to some of those discussions that people had, those chats. So from there came Notes, And then Ray's career sort of took off from there, and hence Lotus Notes. Now he's, I think, CTO at Microsoft. More interesting in some ways is that the kinds of things that we've been talking about doing on the internet for a couple of decades now, we were doing on Plato. And I say that not as a means of sort of boasting about Plato in many ways. It was a very kind of kludgy, backwards system. I mean, it had a touch screen, so-called, right? But it wasn't really a touch screen because the terminal, the screen was inset in the terminal. There were LEDs ringing around the screen. So where you put your finger, it broke the pattern of light. And so that's how the system knew, it had nothing to do with touching the screen whatsoever. But I mean, it's an interesting sort of system because a lot of the things that we're doing now in terms of multiplayer games, talking about music, Space War was on it. It looks ridiculous. I mean, even if we turned off the lights and you could see it better. But this was just a marvel at the time, right? I mean, this was virtually magic for people who saw it. By the time I got there, this was the kind of machine that we were using, that was the inset sort of thing. It was a monochrome and amber sort of light, for which, for whatever reason, we are all sort of victims of of the era in which we first encountered computing, I suppose, much like with music. And I have this terrible nostalgia for this color now. The system was very early on globally networked. But to use it on the internet was sort of hopeless. It took, by the time I got there, there was a 3-second echo for transmitting something off campus. I mean, it made it sort of pointless for any real time, for any kind of synchronous communication. The reason I point out Plato is that it was one of the first systems, right, even preceding the well, that was relatively publicly available and available for research. Now, what's interesting is that not much research took place in terms of, social uses, consequences, research uses, and that's in many ways true of the well too. Instead, where we see some of the earliest work on computer-mediated communication comes out of commercial settings, right? Places where somebody gave somebody else money to study the impact, I always feel like I should put that in quotes, impact, of sort of inserting, as this kind of hypodermic needle model. We'll insert this system in the organization and we'll see what happens. We'll do sort of a pre-test, post-test. If we're lucky, we'll do the pre-test, if we think about it. And then we'll sort of see what happens. And we'll see what people do online, or on these systems. I shouldn't even say online. Most of these were closed systems and were not available for access offsite. Usually these were studies of email, messaging, groupware. Again, all things that we had on Plato. And I'm as much pointing, lest you think, right, that I'm sort of criticizing somebody or some group of researchers. I'm pointing the finger as much as at myself as anyone else. I was there. I didn't think about doing this. And sadly, most of what was done on Plato now exists only in the form of these huge fan-fold printout pages. So it's not something that's accessible electronically. I mean, I suppose you could find a way to scan it or something, but I mean, it's dot matrix printed, so scanning that would probably be more than a little bit difficult in terms of optical character recognition. Most of what was being done at the time took for granted that people were using these systems for interpersonal communication. By the mid-'80s, we start to see a move toward looking at some of the more socio-emotional aspects of use of these systems, in part motivated by an interest in looking at how they were sort of substituting for talking around the water cooler. I have to use the stereotype. Again, though, motivated in no small part by wanting to see whether there were any changes in productivity, right? Because if you could do your water cooler talk, right, on these systems, then presumably you wouldn't have to get up, right, leave your desk and go to the water cooler, and somehow that was going to save, all sorts of time. I guess if you were a huge organization and counting, in seconds. and multiplying that by thousands of workers. And in part because management started to see that work groups were forming around the use of these systems, that people would start communicating with those with whom they normally wouldn't have contact, with whom they normally wouldn't communicate, which then, of course, had some consequences for productivity as well. But we started to see some work that started to ask some more interesting questions about, if we can still couch this in terms of productivity, labor, et cetera, but we can look at this in terms not only of kind of outright productivity, but also in terms of the ways that things like social support and companionship and sense of belonging might be enhanced, and also therefore might enhance productivity. There were frequent comparisons between computer-mediated communication and face-to-face communication. We occasionally still see some of those, and at least in the field of communication, face-to-face communication still occupies somewhat of an ideal place. For a variety of reasons that I really won't go into now, even if I weren't late, I wouldn't have time to get into. But I think it's somewhat of an unfair position for it to hold. So these comparisons are probably not quite as useful, in my opinion, as they might be. The first national survey that we see in the US of internet use comes rather late in the game, which is a shame, right? It's 1995, and it's from the Pew Center for People and the Press. This predates the Pew Internet and American Life Project. And when they did their survey of news use, one of the things that they asked was about email and about internet use. At this point, a lot of people had shifted off of AOL or had started using the internet thanks to having access to it via AOL, among other services, CompuServe, what have you. And I've highlighted these sentences in red because they're just so striking to me every time I see them. And this isn't that long ago, right? But it's, I mean, imagine today, right? Only a third of those who go online say they would miss it a lot if it were no longer available. I don't want to get into, I mean, we could later, if you'd like, if there's time, get into a discussion of internet addiction or whatnot. But I do get a bit anxious, you could say, when I don't have access for a lengthy period of time. It has less to do with sort of being able to get internet, I think, and more to do with knowing that when I do get access again, I'm just screwed. Because there's going to be so much waiting for me to deal with, and that's surely email. But then few see online activities as essential to them. I mean, we're at a point now, 15 years later, where online activities are inescapable. It's nothing so much that they're essential in a sense, but it's almost impossible to be without them. A couple of years later was when the Pew Charitable Trusts, when the board started to think about funding a purely internet-oriented research project. And I was very fortunate, along with Lee Rainey, to be involved in getting that off the ground. And it asks some basic questions, but it missed the boat. Right? I mean, by the time we started going in the field with our survey, our first survey was in late '99. I mean, it's, by that point, we saw some rise, and I think 47%, 46, there's a slide coming up, 46% of people in the US were using the internet. We haven't seen that much growth since. Right? I mean, it's been 10 years, and we're now at, 70-odd%. We missed the really rapid rise in the adoption curve, which is a shame. I mean, I'm glad we started at all, but I do badly wish we could have started earlier. A quick comparison of where we've been in 10 years, at least in the US. A bit of growth in terms of the number of adults using the internet, enormous growth in broadband, which you would sort of expect, some growth in cell phone use. Wi-Fi, we didn't have Wi-Fi when we first started doing our surveys. The cloud notion didn't exist really either. And now, more than ever, people are using mobile connections. It's not really so much a case of, we had all sorts of issues when we first started to construct our script for the survey because we didn't quite know how to put it. You know, what do you say if you're calling people randomly? Did you go online today? Did you use the internet today? Did you access the internet today? Did you dial up today? You know, I mean, and anymore, I mean, I don't even think we don't even think about this. We just take it for granted. You go on the internet. The means by which you go is far less relevant. And it's just sort of generally understood when somebody asks a question like, you know, did you go on the internet today, what they mean. During this same period, we began publishing New Media and Society, and I threw together a word cloud of titles of submissions to the journal. Now, these are submissions. These are not titles of accepted or published manuscripts. This is everything that came across the transom. And I just thought, you know, as kind of a bookend, if you will, you know, to that Pew data, it's sort of interesting to see where scholarly interests have been, at least as measured by looking at the titles of the things they were submitting. There's a lot more that could be done as far as that goes. And considering how much we've published since, it would be pretty interesting to look at things like, you know, the abstracts and the full text and references and what have you. And, you know, that's this was easiest for the moment, but you know, I do plan on sort of sitting down with the whole corpus of text to see where what that might tell us. Now, having said all that, you know, much of our research over this period of time has actually remained remarkably the same in terms of the foundations. We're still asking some very basic questions about, you know, that are rooted, at least for those of us in communication, in a very traditional and rather conservative, some might say, question about communication. Right? And what I'm going to spend the rest of my time doing is trying, and this might not be a group that needs convincing, but I'll be trying to convince you that we need to move out of these kinds of paradigms in terms of our studies of the internet. If I were to boil down the two questions, you know, that are asked in virtually every submission to New Media and Society, for instance, that would be it. You could sort of categorize virtually every manuscript that's submitted under one of those two questions, or both those questions. Right? I mean, some sort of try to do it all, if you will. Most of the research that I'm seeing, both in terms of what comes through New Media and Society, but elsewhere, is still largely quantitative, and it's complemented, which is not to say that, you know, qualitative methods are absent or given short, but it really seems that there's still very much of this kind of, you know, we need to have some empirical bases for. So what we're going to do is we're going to do, and there's a variety of reasons for this, and some of these are very pragmatic reasons. At least in the U.S., they have to do with sort of, you know, the rush to tenure and the feeling that it's never enough in terms of a tenure decision. Grant systems that increasingly require some type of a deliverable, and which, if not required, then strongly encourage research that is in some way or another covered by the media, right? Covered by the press. And you know, if you've ever tried to get some coverage from the press for your research, you've probably found that it's much easier if you can say to a reporter, well, I found that 59% of fill in the blank do fill in the blank online. Right? And if you try to explain to them that, you know, you did an ethnographic study, you know, they'll just tune you out, if not outright hang up. I've been involved in some interesting discussions at the National Science Foundation, where we've had these sorts of debates, really, about particular types of method being privileged as a result. And you know, at this point, I'm sad to say I probably haven't had much influence in those debates. And then another piece of the puzzle is the research ethics systems that we have, at least in the US, which make it incredibly difficult to do anything other than other than survey research of a very kind of, at a very superficial level. That's not to say you can't do other kinds of research, but if you're a junior scholar, if you're aiming toward tenure, you face a choice of either doing something in a manner that's going to be readily approved by an institutional review board, or something that might take you several months, if not longer, to receive approval. Another way to think of this is that it's the equivalent to write a protocol that involves human subjects and direct contact with them, conversation, etc. Writing that protocol is about the equivalent of writing a major research grant. So, if you're balancing what time you have to achieve tenure, with the kind of research that you might want to be able to do, it's not a difficult calculation to make. You're probably going to come out on the side of doing something that's going to be relatively straightforward and easily approved by the IRBs. But I think this is also in part due somewhat to internet developments, right? I mean, one of the things that happens, and it would be interesting to test this in some fashion, is that as a new internet tools, technologies come along, they get our attention. And so it's not very common to find people who've stuck for a very long time looking at a particular internet technology. Another way to put this, maybe more simply, is how many people do you know who are still studying IRC? And how many people do you know who are looking at Twitter now? Right? I mean, there probably still are some folks studying IRC. I haven't seen the research, but I'd be surprised if there was nobody. But there is a tendency to kind of keep going with the flow as these technologies develop, right? So, whatever you think of the term Web 2.0, I dare say that we've probably left behind Web 1.0 in our studies. I could expand on that, but that's going to take us much too long. To give you a graphic illustration of that, this is something that we threw together at the Pew Internet Project. That for me sort of illustrates very well these kinds of changes and their impact not only on everyday life, but also in scholarly life. Right? I mean, if you're a media studies scholar, this is pretty much what you faced about 20, 25 years ago. This was sort of the landscape of technology that you would have available to you for study. And if you're a media studies scholar today, this is kind of what you have.
That's great.
Right? And I mean, this is, we are by nature extraordinarily curious, right? I mean, most people get into the study of communication, technology, media, et cetera, because we're inherently curious about new developments and new things. So it's not reasonable to expect that somebody's going to go back to the way things were. Well, I'm going to stick with, this stuff interests us and it impacts us too, right? I mean, we use it, we find it fascinating, we see things going on that we want to learn about, and so, our research tends to follow along these lines. But what are we going to do as this medium grows increasingly less textual? In some ways, it's been relatively easy when you're dealing with things like IRC or email or even the web to some extent, right? Because storing, right, manipulating, analyzing text is really quite easy when you compare doing those sorts of things with visual media or with sound, right? I mean, there are very pragmatic sort of issues involved that I can get into, but there are also some other issues, such as we need to look to some other disciplines likely to get at sort of the visual aspects of some of the things that are going on now. I mean, I'll just pick on YouTube as an example. It's not enough to sort of look at television, right, and the study of video prior to the internet and say, well, we're going to take methods and modes of analysis from those kinds of studies and sort of shift them over to YouTube. It just doesn't work. Right? If you look at a lot of the study of television in the 70s and 80s in particular, relied on things like generic analysis on reading particular programs as text. And so you can't do this with YouTube in that fashion. Right? It doesn't lend itself. It's not programmed in the same sense. Genres, good luck, right? Because a single YouTube clip that's a minute long could consist of 4 or 5 genres that previously you could say, well, this television program was primarily drama, comedy, etc. A YouTube clip, it could be a couple dozen. So one of the things that's been interesting to me, particularly since I moved some years ago now to the University of Illinois at Chicago, was to try to follow through on what one of my mentors, Jim Carrey, used to say in regard to trying to get a sense of where technology was headed, which was, let's listen to the engineers. So I've been very fortunate to be a part of something called the Electronic Visualization Laboratory at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which has been around since 1973. It probably has 2 claims to fame, although only one is of a mainstream sort, which is that early on in its existence, it provided the video graphics for that scene in the first Star Wars film. And if you see it today, I'm actually shocked that it hasn't been replaced, right? Because George Lucas did this whole, when he redid the films, there were all sorts of things replaced. This would have been dead easy to change. If they could change what Luke Skywalker's father looks like, right, at the end of, Star Wars number 6 or whatever the correct numbering is, to do this would just be a snap. So it was actually kind of nice to see that it remained. The point of the lab really is to try to bring together people from computer science, from art, from communication, basically to see sort of what happens if we think 10 to 20 years out with technology. And a lot of our collaborators are domain scientists as well as computer scientists and the commercial sector as well, although particularly thanks to Tom DeFonte and Dan Sandine, who founded the lab, everything that we do is open source, unless you're a commercial venture, in which case we make you pay a lot. The other claim to fame that we have is developing this thing called the CAVE, which stands for Cave Automated Virtual Environment. We tend to be recursive. We tend to be crazy about acronyms, so I'm not even going to. It's something that I wish I could give you an actual sense of. How many has anybody been in a cave? Well, okay, good. Feel free to chime in that, because it's one of those things like, the whole, dancing about architecture kind of, it's just hard to talk about, and it's hard to look at a video clip as well, right? Because it's in 2D. But I'll give you some sense of it, and I'll probably cut this a little bit short, but you might get some sense of what it looks like.
These 3 walls may not look like much, but we're actually at the intersection of art and technology. I'm Victoria Lauben at the UIC's Electronic Visualization Lab, and we'll watch this. What you're seeing is part of a 3-dimensional virtual reality environment called the CAVE. The Electronic Visualization Lab, or EVL, at University of Illinois at Chicago, brings computer art students and engineering students together to create works of interactive art.
Well, welcome to the cave. These glasses allow you to see in stereo. So when we put these on, we'll be able to see in stereo, like a stereo movie. But since it's virtual reality, we also are in control. We can move and see new worlds, like over here.
Oh!
Now you're at a waterfall.
What's that? That is wild. Look at, I'm going into a queue. I feel like I'm in Twilight Zone.
Probably the most interesting thing about virtual reality is the fact that you're seeing your viewpoint on the world and not somebody else's. It's the first redefinition of perspective since the Renaissance.
Since its development in 1992, the cave has been used both as an artistic medium and as a tool for...
That gives you a little bit of an idea of what it's like maybe. What I want to get across is a couple of things. One is it is incredibly sort of synesthetic. When you're in it, you do feel physically immersed within the environment. You know, one of my first experiences, I was sort of taken up in a building that was about 3 stories high, and then I was told, now walk to the edge, right, and then step off. Right? And I couldn't. Right? I mean, I literally, you know, at first, and then I did, right? And then I just sort of floated to the ground, you know, and I was like a 2-year-old, you know, again, you know, till the machine overheats or something. Now, the reason this is particularly interesting is twofold, I think. One is, you might have heard Dan Sandin mention this is the first redefinition of perspective since the Renaissance. In what he meant there, and, you know, and it's one of those wonders of sound bites, right? When they take something that he takes like an entire lecture to develop, you know, and chop it up into this little 10-second thing. What he's talking about is that for the first time, that the user has control of perspective here. So if you're the artist, right, your world is rocked. Let me explain it this way. Every year, every fall, we have a new crop of MFA students who come in looking to work in the lab. What they're accustomed to is working on canvases, you know, on things that get hung on walls. Maybe they do some video work. Maybe they're into photography. Maybe they've done some things with video games. But in almost every case, they control what the viewer sees. That doesn't work in a fully immersive environment. You could make it work, but then you basically have to take the user and sort of guide them, you know, be as if you're standing by the user, grabbing them by the shoulders and moving them around. Because the user can just go wherever they want to. And so one of the first things we do in the fall after the students, this is going to sound really cruel, after students develop their first environment is we go and break it. Right? Because what they'll do is they'll invariably do something incredibly beautiful. But they won't take into consideration the fact that they no longer have control of who's viewing and how they view it. So what we'll do is we'll just, you know, sort of walk into the environment and go, oh yeah, that looks really great, and then turn around, right, and walk off in this direction, basically walk through what they've developed as a kind of 2D screen in a 3D world. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that the caves are networked via the internet. So if you're in a cave here and I'm in a cave in Chicago, we share that virtual environment. We share the perspective, we share the sound, we share everything, which is a different way of networking than what we're accustomed to. You can only have, you know, you only even need just 1 or 2 points of articulation, right? Like a hand moving, a head nodding, and it's remarkable because even if you look like, I should have had these slides move in the opposite direction, but even if you look like an avatar like that, it's remarkable how quickly people know who you are just by your head movement or the movement of an arm. Identity is, there's a world of research available in terms of how we identify people on the basis of some very simple motions. So it's been interesting to participate in these kinds of settings where what we're doing is networking together virtual environments, right? Not sharing these kind of, you know, like a Second Life space. If you, we tend to be unfairly critical, I think, of Second Life. But you know, having said that, I'm going to do it. Because right, in our case, I mean, we're literally sharing the entirety of this space. We're not looking at it on the screen and then manipulating an avatar to move around and do things. You are the avatar to the people that see you within their space. We've moved on since then to work on things like large displays. This was one of the first ones that we did using LCD panels. These work a lot better for a variety of reasons than projectors. And I won't even get into that. What's interesting here is that, again, in a sense, the environment is being shared. There's somebody brought in here from a distance. These images are coming off the students' laptops and are being shared on the screen. You can take images from the large screen and bring them onto your laptop and vice versa. We generally don't like technology getting in the way. So we've been working on 3D displays that don't require glasses. In this case, the technology for this basically involves having a kind of a webcam that's looking essentially at where your eyes are, and then drawing pictures independently for each eye, and using a lenticular screen in front of the LCD panels. It's actually really old tech. It's the kind of thing that you would find on a 3D picture on a cereal box or some other child's toy. What we found pretty early on, though, is that these kinds of displays look really great, but they're not really functional. It's one thing to sit there, and you can probably see we have a couch. Right? It's fantastic for sitting in front of, but if you want to do some actual work, and you go up to the screen, and you start to do stuff, your arms get tired really fast. Right? This is not a great workspace. To manipulate it from a computer is fine. To actually get up to it, do a touch screen thing, or like in Minority Report, not really very practical. But if you do something with a table, not only is that more practical in terms of physical activity, it's also a more collaborative sort of space. Because we can all get around the table, we can share stuff. I can point this out, zoom in, and you can turn it around and see it from your angle. Our current project is actually working on a desk-sized version of this, which has been really interesting because in the early stages, what we've basically done is replace with 3D the notion of a desktop on a computer. So you can actually sort of pile things up in the space of the screen, right, below the surface level, right, which is kind of an interesting, it sort of makes you think about, how you always have stuff piling up on your desk, right, and now you have stuff piling down. The most recent version of the cave is at King Abdallah University of Science and Technology, KAUST. The resolution is amazing. Let me put it this way. I should probably put a hand over the mic or something, but it's a fact. It's amazing what you can do with this technology nowadays if you're a Saudi billionaire. And the new version of the Lambda wall, right? The mullions are virtually gone, and I'm sure the next iteration they will be gone. Well, I won't get into the case. So, why is any of this stuff important, and why dwell on the cave business, and what does this have to do with internet studies? Well, it has a couple things to do with it. One is, right, if you look at this chart, in terms of what we've been used to, both with data storage and the speed of our CPUs, we're really not increasing our capacity that much. But in terms of optical fiber, we're still going pretty gung-ho. We still have a lot, at least in the US, we still have a lot of dark fiber that's not being used. It's remarkably frustrating to see just how much fiber goes unused in the US, particularly in urban areas like Chicago. The capacity is astounding, and the actual use of it, the access to it, is dreadful. In our case, we've been doing things like terabit networking between here and Amsterdam and Japan, and it works great. The problem we have is we don't really know what to do with it. When you have that much bandwidth, we don't really have applications that'll push through that much data. One of the things that's actually changing that is the new, what's the acronym for the new super collider, whatever the...
LHC.
Yeah, the Large Hadron Collider. That's now generating massive enough amounts of data that it actually starts to fill our pipes, which is pretty cool. And it's the kind of thing that you can actually, sort of say, well, we can do some tests on this network. Prior to this, what we would do is sort of queue up thousands of HD videos, which just didn't seem to be all that useful of a thing to do. One of the reasons it's important to think about these technologies is because it raises some questions about how we're going to deal with content. Right? What's the best way to display stuff? What's the best way to look at stuff? How do you share content? You know, it's interesting to teach in a room with a Lambda wall because you find yourself trying to figure out, well, you know, am I going to use this, which has a trackpad about, you know, smaller than a slice of toast, and how am I going to map that trackpad onto this wall? Or am I going to run alongside it? You know, or am I going to sit there with some sort of pointer and try to move stuff around? You know, we become really accustomed in some ways to using devices in a particular fashion. Persistence becomes an interesting issue. I mean, I've had occasions where, you know, and I always tell this to students, don't take notes, the slides will be available later. And then I'll add some stuff on the wall, and then damned if the wall doesn't crash. I've never had a chalkboard crash. And I don't know that we're ever going to quite get to the point where this is going to be as robust that we can say it's never, you know, it'll never happen. Maybe, you know, some years down the line we will. But, I mean, again, you know, it brings up some interesting issues in terms of, because we're starting to see the deployment of these things in classrooms at universities around the country. How do you train people to use them? Right? How will they train themselves to use them? Are going to be, you know, because I've been trained, for better or worse, by Microsoft Word. Right? So about every 1 to 2 minutes, no matter what software I'm using, I save whatever I'm working on, which is incredibly unproductive. Right? But I mean, it's just sort of almost muscle memory. Interaction becomes different. It was a really interesting thing to see that when we started teaching a course in collaboration with Moscow State University, we thought for a long time, you know, what can we give students that they don't already have? I mean, they come to campus, you know, it used to be that 10 or 15 years ago, campuses could sort of tout, we're going to give you broadband, you know, you'll have Ethernet in your dorm room. You know, that doesn't really matter that much anymore, does it? They probably have access at home. They probably come with pretty good PCs or laptops. We're not giving them all that much that they don't already have access to. So we thought, well, you know, we can give them access to, you know, something like, you know, terabit networks, the devices that we're developing in the lab. We can let them use those things. So we started teaching a course with Moscow State University. It was a game design course. And we said, you know, we're going to set aside a room where you're going to have a large screen. You're going to have essentially a terabit connection between the two campuses. And we're going to stick an HD video camera in the room. You know, so on both sides. And you know what? You don't need anything else for video conferencing. Once you have that, you don't really need to have like a document reader and what have you. You can just take the camera, right, and point it at whatever you want them to see on the other side. So this is the room that you have to work on your collaborative projects, right, between the two universities. You're going to be designing a game in collaboration. And what we started to see was that, you know, interaction really changed here. They didn't, in previous classes, they basically had to use Skype or other sort of difficult to use and not very robust means of video conferencing. You know, doing something like this, where they had full HD video, they would literally start to hang out together in this room. You know, we'd find them in there, not necessarily working, just, you know, talking about sports or whatever. I mean, it started to change. When you knew that this was on all the time, the quality was really good, you didn't have to completely panic and be, you know, sort of in a state rushed to try to get your work done before it screws up again. So they started kind of, in some ways, almost take for granted that they had this available, and they started to use it as they might use a lounge, which is kind of an interesting for us to see. But it brought up some other, you know, interesting issues for it. And bridging distance was a snap. Bridging time, we don't have the technology for that. You know, so we had, I think with Moscow, we had a 12 or 13-hour time difference. Well, you know, that's okay if you're a student. You know, what do you do with sound? Localizing sound is still really difficult in settings in which we put these technologies. They tend to be very square rooms. They tend to be very reflective. It's next to impossible to put some form of speaker behind an LCD screen or something. So we have some issues to work with on there. But the thing is, I mean, when we first announced the Cave in 1992, nobody really would have thought that it would become a household device. But when I left the U.S. In early April, every circular for every electronics chain was touting 3D televisions, right? Flat panel screen. Forget your 2D, and you can call it a marketing ploy, and it is, but that's not all it is. The number of Hollywood productions that are already available in 3D is actually quite surprising. Sports is next. Right. I'm somewhat surprised to not see World Cup being touted as available in 3D, although considering that it's virtually untouted in the US, maybe I just haven't seen it. Although I was in Copenhagen for a month, I didn't see it much touted there. So that may not be an event that'll have 3D yet. But that's not the only place we'll see it. Virtually every video game console manufactured in the last 5 years has the capability of 3D output. And it has, I dare say, a better graphics engine than what we've been able to use in the lab. Proprietary, so we haven't been able to do anything with it in the lab, but the graphics that some of these boxes generate are just astonishing and are probably going to rival, if not better, the kinds of things that are coming out of Hollywood. So I'd like to finish up here in a little bit by posing a couple of approaches. One is, if we take, I think we can take a kind of qualitative approach here. My friend John Pauly came up with this kind of three-way division of qualitative approaches to the study of media by looking at it as a product, as a practice, and as a commentary. And I think we're doing some of each of these things in Internet studies now. But we're not pushing them very far at all, particularly when we think about some of the newer, more visual technologies that are coming down the line. And I'll give you a quick example of why this is important. Right? I mean, this is from a couple of weeks ago when the ash cloud was actually a huge thing. New York Times headline, "Stranded travelers turn to video conferencing," as if we've just discovered video conferencing. What an amazing thing. Next time you're in an airport, I urge you to look for how many advertisements you can find for video conferencing technologies. Because it's astonishing to me that anybody who owns, who leases this space in an airport would allow this to happen. Because it's sort of like, you walk in, it's like saying, don't fly. Just turn around, leave the airport, because you can do this with video conferencing, and you can do it just about as well. But the fact is, this isn't actually what's driving video conferencing at this point. I don't think we published on this yet, but who wants to take a guess at who the #1 users of Skype are in the US? Who are the #1 users? I'll give you a hint. You could guess this by age group, perhaps.
Foreign students?
Nope.
Grandparents?
Grandparents. Yeah, for staying in touch with grandchildren. Yeah, I mean, it's really remarkable how this technology sort of leapfrogged business in a way, right? And is heavily used by grandparents.
That was the market for the video phone.
Yeah, and
Yes.
yeah. I'll skip over. One of the reasons this is particularly important, you might recall Cass Sunstein's, I almost call this a blog entry, but that's not really what it was it? Essay in the Boston Review. And I've highlighted this paragraph because it bears on the following slide. But basically what the point of this was that in some ways the Internet's and heavy Internet use is going to lead us to the realization of Nick Negroponte's Daily Me. We're going to become atomized individuals without a public sphere, et cetera, et cetera. Right? This is followed up actually not long ago, last month, with a study by Gensko and Shapiro, that said that the internet's not going to do this. That in fact, what is going to segregate us, we find that ideological segregation of online news consumption is low in absolute terms, higher than the segregation of most offline news consumption, and significantly lower than the segregation of face-to-face interactions with neighbors, coworkers, or family members. Well, what's going to happen, right, if we have more face-to-face interactions, but via technology? And so one of the ways I think that this might happen, I'll come back to this, is by way of lifelike avatars. Probably the craziest project that I've been involved with at the lab is this thing called Project Lifelike, where we are, in fact, developing lifelike avatars. And it's not that hard to do. Right? I mean, it's done with off-the-shelf technology. And I have a video clip that I'm actually going to skip. It shows a guy getting dressed up in a motion capture suit in our lab and how he, how we get pictures of him and how we turn him into an avatar and that kind of thing. But I'm going to skip over that. The point of this is we can now combine lifelike avatars with information about the individuals the avatar represents. Right? So you might have heard about or seen Microsoft's photosynth technology that basically lets you take photos, right, including ones that are available on the internet, and create 3D environments from them. This will explain it better than I can, so I'm actually going to let this run for just a little bit.
Which really marries two different technologies. One of them is Sea-Dragon, and the other is some very beautiful computer vision research done by Noah Snavely, graduate student at the University of Washington, co-advised by Steve Seitz at UW and Rick Zalisky at Microsoft Research. A very nice collaboration. And so this is live on the web. It's powered by Sea-Dragon. You can see that when we kind of do these sorts of views, where we can dive through images and have this kind of multi-resolution experience. But the spatial arrangement of the images here is actually meaningful. The computer vision algorithms have registered these images together so that they correspond to the real space in which these shots, all taken near grassy lakes in the Canadian Rockies, all these shots were taken. So you see elements here of stabilized slideshow or panoramic imaging, and these things have all been related spatially. I'm not sure if I have time to show you any other environments. There are some that are much more spatial, but I'd like to jump straight to one of Noah's original data sets, and this is from an early prototype of photosynth that we first got working in the summer, to show you what I think is really the punchline behind this technology, the photosynth technology. And it's not necessarily so apparent from looking at the environments that we put up on the website. We had to worry about the lawyers and so on. This is a reconstruction of Notre Dame Cathedral that was done entirely computationally from images scraped from Flickr. You just type Notre Dame into Flickr, and you get some pictures of guys in t-shirts and of the campus and so on. And each of these orange cones represents an image that was discovered to belong to this model. And so these are all Flickr images, and they've all been related spatially in this way. We can just navigate in this very simple way. I never thought that I'd end up working at Microsoft. It's very gratifying to have this kind of perception here. So this is, as you can see, this is lots of different types of cameras. It's everything from cell phone cameras to professional SLRs. Quite a large number that have been registered together into this environment. If I can find some of the sort of weird ones, so many of them are included by faces and so on. There's somewhere in here. There's actually there are a series of photographs. Here we go. This is actually a poster of Notre Dame that registered correctly. Okay, so if we can dive in from the poster to a physical view of this environment. So what the point here really is that we can do things with the social environment. This is now taking data from everybody, from the entire collective memory of visually of what the Earth looks like, and link all of that together. All of those photos become linked together, and they make something emergent that's greater than the sum of the parts. You have a model that emerges of the entire Earth. Think of this as the long tail to Stephen Lawler's virtual Earth work. And this is something that grows in complexity as people use it, and whose benefits become greater to the users as they use it. Their own photos are getting tagged with metadata that somebody else entered. If somebody bothered to tag all of these saints and say who they all are, then my photo of Notre Dame Cathedral suddenly gets enriched with all that data. And I can use it as an entry point to dive into that space, into that metaverse, using everybody else's photos, and do a kind of cross-modal and cross-user social experience that way. And of course, a byproduct of all of that is immensely rich virtual models of every interesting part of the Earth.
So, I think it's interesting to think about it as he's putting it here, but I think we can also think about this at a sort of different level, which is the level of the individual or the family. Right? Virtually everybody who's been born in the last 10 years has an enormous digital archive, right? Photos, video, audio, and you can do this sort of thing with family photos. And you can actually quite easily populate a kind of AI back end to a lifelike avatar. Because what you can do is not only parse the photos and see where people have been, but you could probably figure out who they've been with, because they're going to show up in the photos too. Right? And so you start to build this kind of memory set based on existing, the kind of stuff that used to be in a shoebox for generations, perhaps. But for young people today, I mean, I'll pick on my own kids because they're young enough to not know what I'm talking about at this point, and they won't beat me up on this until I'm probably long gone. A 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, I have roughly, and this is very rough, but I have roughly 60,000 photos in some way or other related to them, places we've been, or of them with family, with relatives, with friends, etc. So imagine being able to do something like this with that, and then being able to connect it out, right, to the larger environment to add more information about places, periods in time, where the photos are geotagged, time and date stamped, right? Being able to then locate them spatially, and we're going to be doing this with video any moment, right? I mean, this is Sony's 3D camera that should be on the street this summer. What's part of what's actually driving some of these technologies is, in fact, the realization on the part of companies like Microsoft that we have too many photos. We had an interesting meeting with a couple of the research team from Photosynth, who basically said one of the things that caused them to look more into it is that it's become very difficult, if not impossible, for people to go through that many photos one by one. Right? It's one thing to have a shoebox in a closet, and you can just sort of leisurely kind of thumb through those. When you've got 60,000 photos, and then video, I mean, that's going to be even more difficult, right? Because you can't just sort of thumb through it nearly as quickly as you can. You can sort of scrub through it, or look at frame, every X frames, but that's going to be even more difficult to deal with. So I'll go to this last slide. Thanks to one of my first students in the lab, Jim Costigan, we developed this basically sort of 4-part distinction that we think demonstrates where our research needs to go in regard to internet studies. We need to pay particular attention to each of these 4 dimensions to make our studies as rich as the media and the interactions that we encounter when we use them. Visualization ought to be obvious. Interaction ought to be relatively obvious. Collaboration ought to be relatively obvious. And immersion ought to be, but we mean this in more than kind of the obvious way, that we need to be to study immersion in the sense that it happens in the cave. We also need to understand something about immersion of ourselves as pieces of a larger textual, visual, sonic landscape that now exists on the internet, interlinked, thanks to these kinds of technologies, and particularly thanks to the availability of broadband and increased accessibility to fiber. I'll end right there with acknowledgments. I think that's long enough. Not that there's anything wrong with the folks who fund us. Thank you all. Again, my apologies for being delayed. Thanks for your attention. Be happy to take any questions, comments. Thanks.
Your place do together that you find that they're doing in a kind of video conferencing way? And why, the second question, I guess, is why in the larger world, apart from grandparents, do people not use the technology in your view?
So with the first question, what do you mean? What do they do that's more like traditional video conferencing?
Well, why do they use the video part, and why do you think they're not using kind of audio conferencing?
Yeah,
that's often a kind
I actually think this. I think I can answer both questions surprisingly. Perhaps not to your satisfaction, but still, they don't mind being seen. To put that in a somewhat Monty Python-esque way. Right? What sort of overcomes, there's this kind of, it's the barrier, I think, that sort of a certain generation or certain generations feel about being on camera at all. In the same way that, oh my God, there's a video camera there, we change our behavior. And I think for a younger generation, it doesn't matter that the camera's there. They're accustomed to it in some way. And I don't know how that, but I think it's an interesting thing to look into further. For grandparents, whatever sort of anxiety they might feel about it, it just all sort of boils away when they can see their grandchildren and have that sort of access to them. So I think that kind of removes any anxiety they might feel about being on camera. I think that has a lot to do with it, because what we, I don't think, we don't keep an archive of the students. We could if we didn't do any research with it. Right, now I'm going back to this whole IRB business. Right, but if we could potentially get around this by saying that we're engaging in routine educational practice, and therefore we're exempt from, but somebody is liable to come back to us and say, well, this isn't routine at all. You're one of the few that's doing it, so we can't. In any event, I have given some thought. We should save an archive and do some research on this. We haven't seen any of the students engaging in anything, sort of illegal, illicit, etc. So I don't think it's really. I think it's more a matter if they don't mind what to me would feel like an intrusion by having this kind of, and even the language that I'm going to use reveals something about the mindset. They don't mind being under surveillance. And it's not, I think, because it's a reciprocated sort of surveillance. They just don't seem to think that way. Now, whether that maps in some way onto the kinds of discussions and debates about, a younger generation's feelings toward privacy, as illustrated by Facebook and whatnot, I don't know. But I think that'd be an interesting thing to look at. But it really does seem to be the case that they just don't care. They like having the space. They're working with with our students anyway, and they start to develop a kind of relationship there that continues. We haven't followed up much either, but it'd be interesting to do some, follow-up study and see, was there that sense of the relationships were breaking off, or did they try to maintain it via Skype or some other means? There's another sort of answer to your question, particularly about the students, which is that because this is a game design class, they have to see what they're doing. And so if we give them the technology, if they do a Skype thing, and then they try to use some sort of collaborative space to show screens or video or something, that invariably breaks. Right? Whereas having a computer in the room and an HD camera, and having the camera pointed at them when they're talking, and then kind of go, wait, take a look at this, and then moving the camera around and just pointing at their screen, it works, and it works constantly. And I think that's part of what they appreciate too, is that sort of, not only is it always on, but it always works, and it works really well. And for them, that seems to count for more than anything else. If they have to, they don't have to deal with more stuff. It's simpler, it's more convenient, etc.
Can I? I think this the Electronic Visualization Laboratory. It seems like a rich place to look at what social scientists or cultural studies people have contributed to the design of technology. Because a lot of these projects still seem technically driven. I mean, even the Lifelike project is a technical gimmick, not necessarily a market-driven or socially driven. I mean, are there good sort of success stories of where social research or multidisciplinary research has really shaped technical design?
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat hard to say. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think these are technically driven. Part of the reason is that in order to get funding, I mean, virtually probably 80 to 90% of our funding comes from the National Science Foundation. In order to get funding, we have to be looking far enough out. So from that standpoint, I mean, it's really hard to do something that interdisciplinary and short term. And so what we've done is we routinely get together groups of people to do kind of brainstorming sessions across disciplines. We've been doing this increasingly with people in our medical school, and increasingly with people who work with patients directly, to see how we might be able to do some things that would, for instance, bring patients and families closer together in situations where you couldn't, where somebody's, say, in such a sterile environment that you couldn't be in the room with them, that sort of thing. But what invariably happens is that when people think about applications, they don't think that far out. And it's one of the quirks, really, of working in our lab is that we always need people to come and tell us what applications they might see for some of our technology. I mean, we can do some things, I mean, like having a terabit network. Well, why? I mean, the National Science Foundation thinks this is stupendous. Right? So a lot of our research is funded because it's to do with high-speed networking. What we're able to do sort of on the technological end is really sort of quite beyond where some of the applications even are. So we're always bringing in people from other disciplines too. And so, we had geologists come in who saw some of the, and we can do 3D, a single wall 3D thing with 2 projectors now. So for under $10,000, you can get an incredibly large, good stereo image. And they saw all sorts of things they could do with it just in teaching geology. And there's now, and so there's a kit online at at evl.usc.edu that'll tell you how to set this up in a classroom. And the last we counted, and we kind of gave up, there were over 500 classrooms around the world that were using this. And that's the incredibly gratifying part. But it doesn't, sadly, pay the bills. The NSF wouldn't give us anything for something like that.
Maybe one more question, or you okay? Yes, please.
I'm always interested in what technology can offer us and how we're going to use it for. It seems like a lot of attention has been focused on how to create such a real virtual space, which is really similar to what we have in the real world. But technically speaking, I'm thinking it can't be possible to have such a real space, because then we get confused. What is our real world and what is that real virtual world? So I'm thinking with the tendency of such kind of research would be focused on more what technology can offer us differently to our real reality.
Well, I guess my question back to you is really, how different are the virtual and the real? I mean, in some ways, they're really not all that different. Our perception of them might be different. But the way things operate, in many ways, is now uncannily similar. You can create new worlds in virtual reality in ways that you can't very easily do in the real world. And there's a lot of interesting work being done there. But in terms of being able to manipulate worlds, it's actually been pretty remarkable sort of how the virtual and the real are sort of merging in some ways, right? I mean, some of the demonstrations, we've seen remarkably convincing demos of of paint that'll change color depending on application of electrical current. I mean, that's just the first step toward essentially being able to paint a monitor onto a wall. How different are these worlds going to be in the future? They may not be all that different. What are the consequences of that? I mean, we could go on discussing that for a long time.
Yes, okay.
I just have a little application that I've wondered about for years in a cave atmosphere. When you buy furniture, when you choose paint for your home, you can never really get the right vision of what it'd be like. And it'd be really nice to have a 3D version of a CAD kind of program that you're moving around. So is there some cooperation between design people? And,
there's a lot. But unfortunately, I don't know of any that's happening at the level to which consumers would have access. So they're auto companies, architectural firms, design shops around the world who are using the technology for that very purpose. Yeah, but I don't know that anybody's using it at the consumer level, at least not yet. I could see that quickly changing as flat panel 3D screens come into the home. And if I were, a large paint manufacturer, I'd certainly want to be looking at that.
Allison, last question.
Well, I just wanted to shift the focus a little bit because you alluded to this at the beginning and then didn't really follow up. The idea that actually it's not so much our individual interactions with other people who we might be encountering in virtual spaces that is being shifted as the nature of the internet shifts, but also our kind of public interaction and our sense of ourselves as members of various types of publics and our relationships, as collective actors, vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis each other. So I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, I sort of skipped a couple slides there toward the end, and I do. I mean, I think it would probably, it might take longer than we have. But what's been particularly interesting to me with this is that there are numerous uses. I mean, the photosynth is, can be read another way, right? Which is that it's a great example of how to take this stuff that exists that other people have created, that in some cases extraordinarily personal, and then kind of forge it into this other thing for like this other object. But it's also, it's not merely an object, right? Because it's really rather dynamic, and it's something that can greatly shift with perception and use and connection to other similar sorts of objects. Now, I don't think we've really gone to any great lengths to think about how power operates within these kinds of what Blaise called collective memory, or you could even just call it the cloud, or however you want to put it. So it's not simple. I think simply a case of having these images available and being able to search them and and look at them, but being able to combine them with other images and do things with them that we haven't really done. Again, purely on a theoretical level, we haven't really done very much with it all. And for me, changes very much the notion of what the public sphere is. I mean, I don't have any concerns that the public sphere is going away, but I think it's greatly changing. And I think we've only been, like in the Gensker-Shapiro, I mean, we're still in that kind of Cass-Sunstein model of, the public sphere is, it's the news or it's text or it's this kind of particular type of interaction. But I think it's so much more than that, and in ways that involve an exercise of power that I think hasn't been much under consideration yet. But I could go on.
Be television cubed, where we'll just be completely immersed in our television sets.
Watching the election.
No public.
That's producing.
Well, I mean, watching the election is very different when you are, when you're commenting on Twitter and you're reorganizing your own experience of the election. And
no, it's been a treat. I have to, for me, it's been a treat watching the UK election. I don't know about those of you in the UK quite what you make of it. But to watch the television coverage of it and then watch online coverage of it has been absolutely fascinating. I've always, a quick aside, I guess, I've always had a good sense of the differences in scale between the US and UK because I used to be a musician. And it was always so much easier to play in the UK. You could go everywhere, but stay in the same motel. So I always, but then to see this sort of replicated in a sense in terms of public debate and discourse about the election, but to see sort of television kind of treat it. I mean, the television coverage of it here is virtually identical to what television coverage in the U.S. is of the presidential election. I mean, the frames are the same, the visuals are it's just, but then online it's sort of completely different, and it takes on a kind of locality that is completely unknown, I think, to most everyone in the U.S., with the exception of a few people who are who are particularly active in grassroots political organizations. But there are very few of those. I dare say there are fewer in the U.S., even though it's a much larger country. There are probably still fewer people involved at the level that they're involved here. So it's been fascinating to watch the differences.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.